Welcome back to our series on Bach's Orgelbüchlein. Today we're looking at one of the Advent chorales. It's the second one, in fact, in the collection, with the dual title Gott, durch, deine, Güte, or Gottes Sohn ist kommen. These are, at least the first one is clearly an Advent chorale, rather more penitential than the second one, which certainly has Christmas overtones to it. The second one, Gottes Sohn ist kommen, is still in the hymn book and still much used today. If you have the feeling that the melody is slightly familiar and you're from an English-speaking background, then you'll be familiar with the tune which is known by the title Ravenshaw, which is used for the hymn Lord Thy Word Abideth, and that is a shortened version of the same melody. So in this episode I really want to help with the registration, with the pedals, and with two particularly tricky bars, which we'll come to presently. The piece has got 4 layers. 2 of them are formed by the chorale melody itself, which is in canon between the right hand and the pedals, canon at the octave, 1 bar apart. A very straightforward and really rather impressive canon. The canon itself is very nearly exact. There's just a small adjustment in bar 7/8 and 9/10. The other 2 layers, I said there were 4 layers, are the constantly moving quaver movement in what you might call the alto part, and the crotchet movement in what you might call the tenor part, which jogs along throughout. The crotchet movement in the tenor part lies actually lower than the pedal part, and therefore it forms the bass for most of the piece. This is an unusual arrangement for Orgelbüchlein. It is actually mirrored by the canon on In Dulce Jubilo, which does exactly the same. And those are the only 2 pieces in Orgelbüchlein where the left hand consistently is lower than the pedals and acts as the bass. So, registration. Well, this is one of those cases where you would think that the registration is absolutely straightforward. It is, after all, the only piece, in fact, in Orgelbüchlein where Bach writes in the registration he wants. An 8-foot principal on the manual and an 8-foot trumpet on the pedals. So that's absolutely fine. But the only problem is that neither of those necessarily is exactly what you think they mean. So first of all, the 8-foot principal on the manual. When Bach talks about an 8-foot principal, what he is meaning is that the principal should be at 8 foot, as opposed to an 8-foot principal. The difference is that that can imply other stops as well. It simply means that the principal stop should not be a 4-foot stop or a 2-foot stop, it should be an 8-foot stop. So it is defining the timbre, the nature of the sound. It's worth mentioning at this point that at least in the British and I think American organ design, a principal stop or a diapason stop is going to be substantially louder than, say, a flute stop. So the difference between a principal and something else is going to be primarily one of volume. That's not necessarily the case with the German Baroque organ, where they might equally be the same volume, but just different sounds. So the principle defines not the amount of sound, but the quality of the sound. It defines the fact that it's a relatively thin, open, straight pipe, as opposed to a flute or a gedacht or what have you. So principle simply defines the nature of the sound, and the 8-foot principle defines that the 8 foot is the pitch at which the principle is pitched. So it opens for a variety of stops there. Secondly, the 8-foot trumpet and the pedals. Again, that is saying 8 foot in relation to the notes on the page. So it's defining the pitch of the music. Now, one thing which strikes us immediately in playing this piece, certainly if we are familiar with Baroque mid-German organs, is that almost no organ at all has a pedal board which goes beyond C or sometimes D. In other words, this particular piece, where the music goes right up to a top F, is not playable on almost any existing German Baroque organ. In Bach's time, there is only one organ which we know of on which he could have played a top F. That was in Weissenfels, which is a small town halfway between Jena and Leipzig, with which Bach was actually familiar, and he did play the organ there. In fact, he had a job in Weissenfels. And coincidentally, the melody of this hymn appears to have been written in Weissenfels, but that has nothing to do with it at all. The point is that on most instruments, you cannot play a top F. The same problem actually arises in the toccata in F-dur, in F major, coincidentally in the same key, where again the complicated pedal solos go right up to a top F. And once again, there are very, very few organs on which that could have been played. And so there is a manuscript of that particular piece which has been reorganized by Krebs the Elder in Altenberg, in which he has arranged it effectively so that it can be played on an organ which only goes up to C pedal. And I use that arrangement quite often when I play that piece on mid-German Baroque organs. So how did Bach intend this to be played? Well, if you can't play the notes as written on the paper, then you can play it an octave lower with a 4-foot trumpet. And Bach did have some instruments with a 4-foot trumpet available. So what he is saying is not so much that these are the notes and it is to be an 8-foot trumpet, but that these are the notes in relation to an 8-foot sound. So if you have a 4-foot trumpet or a coupler which will allow you access to a 4-foot trumpet on the pedals, then feel free to use it. It is actually so much easier to play an octave lower as well. Don't feel that you're cheating or that you're disrespecting Bach's wishes by doing that, because you're not. It's absolutely fine. So tempo. We've talked elsewhere about tempo, so I won't go on about it too much just here. It wants obviously to be a slow 3 and a bar for the chorale, and the quaver movement is going to pretty much define what is a good tempo for your instrument and your building. I don't think you'll be in any great doubt about an appropriate tempo when you put all the parts together. So there's 2 tricky bars. I said that there were 2 bars which were a little bit difficult, and we'll have a look at those now. They are bars 7 and 22. So before we go on with this, I'll remind you of a thing. You're learning the music from the end, aren't you? If you're not quite sure why you're doing that, then stop at this point and go off and watch the episode on how to learn a piece, the Learning to Learn episode. That was the one, I think, on Vater Unser im Himmelreich. And there you'll see why. If you're learning from the end and you're not going any further towards the beginning until you can actually cope with these 2 places, then you will solve the problems quite straightforwardly. So let's look first of all at bar 22. The difficulty here is just one of disentangling what the various lines are doing. So each voice has got its own linear logic, and they just get tangled up. So we've got first of all the chorale melody line. The F gets interrupted by an F in the alto, but it's important then to hold it down because it's the chorale melody, so it has to run the alto to the G. So we just play an F for the first quaver and then hold the next F down. The 5th quaver is a D, which sounds together with the tenor C. Although the tenor C is notated as a crotchet, that too can only be a single quaver because the 6th quaver in the alto is also a C. And then there's a D crotchet above the quavers B flat and A. So although the part writing needs to be logical, in practice it's going to look after itself. So it's a lot more practical for you to lay the thing out like this. So in other words, keep working on it analytically. The one thing which you mustn't do is to keep starting back at the beginning, trying again and failing in the hope that it'll get better next time, because it won't, I promise. Work analytically, stop, take it part by part, find out exactly what's going on. The one thing which we said in the episode on Vaterunser is that you can't learn something until you know what it is that you're trying to learn, and this is a prime example of it. And try it in different ways, different combinations of parts, different speeds, different rhythms, and then go off and have a coffee and come back and try it again. Perhaps when you've managed to sort it out, go off and sleep on it. That is actually a thing. It is medically proven that when you learn something analytically one day, when you've had a night's sleep, your brain will process what you've learnt and will put it into practice the next day. So you will be able to play things readily and flowingly the next day that you couldn't do the previous day because you had learnt them and then slept on it. It really does work. But as I said repeatedly in the episode on learning, just going back to the beginning and having another go is absolutely a self-destructive thing to do. At bar 7, that's a different sort of problem. By and large, the quavers in this piece are taken by the right hand, but just here in bar 7, there's a trill in the top part with the quavers, the best part of an octave below. So can you do that in one hand? Because I can't. You need to juggle the quavers between the hands. Just work out a solution that works for you, learn it slowly, and then stick with it. Again, it'll take a bit of half-speed work and some alternative rhythms and a pint or two of coffee and a good night's sleep. Just be patient with yourself. And again, whatever you do, don't keep going back to the beginning and trying again. The articulation, well, keep it simple. The chorale melody obviously needs to be legato. The crotchets, I would suggest, want to be lightly detached. Jum, 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 enough to give them each their own separate identity, but to keep them as a coherent whole. And the quavers are likely to fall automatically into a pattern, and that is absolutely fine. Go for it. And ornaments, there's just that one trill in bar 7. Think yourself lucky that Bach didn't repeat the trill in the pedals, the following bar. There's no other ornaments in the piece, and the nature of the piece and the nature of the part writing is such that there's really no call to add anything more, not even in the case of the final cadence.